Hey Justin, I am doing my rejoinder to your presentation on divorce and remarriage. So I'm watching your video. There's several things that immediately jumped out to me as far as just the way you handled the topic as a whole. One of the first things that I would give you a lot of credit for is I think you handled this whole topic of divorce and remarriage. I think you handled it with great reverence and a great seriousness. And this is a topic that a lot of times our culture takes with a very light heart, with a very flippant nature. And obviously, Scripture takes it seriously, so we should too. And I think that the first thing I noticed is throughout your video, throughout your presentation, you consistently show the seriousness of the issue. You show in your personal reflections, you talked about how about the damage that it can do to the children who have to go through divorce. You talked about the how commonplace it's become. I think you did a great job also starting out by talking about how it has skyrocketed in popularity. I think you did a great job hammering home how serious this issue is and how common it is, and regrettably so. It's something that has exploded. It's something that has become. You mentioned in the beginning that it's increased 700% over the past 50 years. It's way more than I would have even expected. And I think so. I think you did a good job at just handling the seriousness and showing how pertinent and how important this topic is. You started out, interestingly enough, so you started your presentation in a similar vein as I did by talking about how the importance of defining marriage. So my presentation was on contraception, and I thought that in order to properly cover that topic of what is and isn't fair game as far as what can Christians use for birth control, I thought that I also had to start by giving a good theology of marriage. And so I think you gave a good definition there as well in talking about emphasizing two becoming one, and I think that in particular is a key point when talking about divorce and remarriage. And I think that's a key part of why it is that God so hates divorce, as you mentioned and you brought up several times, that biblical point that God hates divorce. And I believe a large part of it is because of that unity aspect that you talked about, that because this is two who are meant to become one. This is, and as well as you talked about how this is meant to be a picture of God's love to his church and God's relationship to his church, to his bride. That's why this is taken so seriously in Scripture. It's God's design. It's an analogy as well for God and the church. And it is meant to be two becoming one. It's God's intended role for us. And to undo that undoes God's intended role. I think you did a great job hitting on that point. I think you did a good use of Scripture, where you showed us both Old and New Testament passages. You were able to present to us both. Here's what the Old Testament law has to say. You presented to us, hey, here's the words of Christ. I think you also did a good job emphasizing seeking a heart of restoration in marriages, and that, truth be told, in a lot of times with problematic marriages, what should happen instead of divorce is that these couples should do absolutely everything possible to seek restoration. And yeah, the reality is that there's definitely marriages today that don't do that, and there's a lot of marriages that see divorce as the quick route. They just want to resolve to irreconcilable differences and then move on. I thought you also did a good job touching on what can be a very sensitive topic as far as how do you handle an abusive marriage, because unfortunately this isn't addressed as clearly in Scripture as we'd like it to be. But I think the principles you brought up, I think, were good. That you separate the abusive couple and do what you can to reconcile, do what you can to bring healing to that situation. I think that is consistent with the biblical ethic. Yeah, I think you did a good job handling that in a very sensitive and a very mindful way. Probably one of the few things I would have done differently is when you got to the topic of remarriage. It's not that I necessarily disagreed with what you said. I think I probably would have stressed a little bit more in Matthew 19:9 when Jesus talks about one who divorces his wife and marries another, except for the reason of sexual immorality, commits adultery. You had mentioned that point. I probably would have just spent a little bit more time walking through that. In many cases, people will divorce and remarry, and we're not given a whole lot of biblical reasons in which someone can divorce and remarry. Now, death is obvious, and as you discussed, death is obviously understood as something that can happen, and that's definitely a biblical exception, no doubt. I think you hit on that great. I probably would have spent a little more time just touching on remarriage is something that people feel very comfortable doing, and the reality, and biblically speaking, remarriage is really only for the one of the two in the couple who was not unfaithful. So if one spouse gets cheated on, the spouse that got cheated on but was still faithful in that relationship, that is the one who is justified in remarrying. But I think I think there's times as a culture well, even as a church, sometimes we kind of default to this cultural standard that even the one who is unfaithful can and should get remarried, and yet I have issues with that, just because I don't think that Scripture gives a provision for that situation. Of course, there's always a path for reconciliation, and I do think, and I would even go as far as to say that even in a marriage in which one of the two is unfaithful to the other, I would still say they should do whatever they can to try and reconcile. They should do what they can to try and save the marriage. But sometimes that's not possible when a spouse has been unfaithful. I would have emphasized that there are times that I would say probably more often than not, what they should do is they should seek to still try and save the marriage, try to reconcile if at all possible. So I probably would have emphasized some of those points a little bit more, and I don't think you missed those. I probably would have spent a little more time on those, but you still covered a lot of ground. So you certainly put a lot of time and effort into this. It's very clear that you did your homework. It's very clear that you did your time handling a very sensitive topic. And I think using the biblical text, I think, is one of your strongest arguments to help show that there are times where there's a biblical case for divorce. I have met those who will hold to a ground of that there is no case whatsoever in which divorce is permissible or ethical for a Christian. But I think your use of Scripture, I think, is how you helped walk through. Well, hold on now, that Scripture does give us, Jesus himself gives us that provision. And so I think that's your strongest argument against the opposing view, that you show, because essentially we are always talking here about a Christian ethic, because you emphasize, well, here's what Scripture says. You're just laying out Scripture for us. I think that's where you did a great job giving such a good defense of your Christian ethic as well. I think so. I think top to bottom, I think you did a great job handling this, and I also like the way you rounded out with your personal reflections. I've spent time in college ministry as well, and so I've also seen for some in college ministry who even at that point, as you kind of touched on, even at that age, there's still some of the fallout, some of the scars from coming out of divorces as a child. And I think you did a great job touching on the importance of premarital counseling as well. I remember seeing studies about, and I'm not going to remember the numbers off the top of my head, but I know that couples who go through premarital counseling books together have a significantly lower divorce rate. I believe it helps lower the divorce rate by 40%, if I remember correctly. And so I think you did a good job touching on that as well. So yeah, top to bottom, I think you did a great job, man. So keep up the good work, and enjoyed watching your presentation.